have with us Starlyn Priest, who is EIR here at Case Western Reserve University. She's also management and law alum as well, and she's going to be here to talk about company formation. So I'll turn it over to you, Starlyn, to kind of lead things.
Right. Thank you so much, Doug. Good afternoon, everyone. So today's presentation is called Launching the Startup. So the nuts and bolts of company formation. So we will focus on, kind of some of the different options for when you want to form a corporate entity and some of the components that go into making those decisions. So just a quick overview of the presentation here. We'll start off with some really quick introductions of who I am, and then we will go into, some considerations that you want to make before actually launching actually filing for a corporate entity. And the entities that, or the presentation will basically take you through, your checklist. What do you want to consider when you're making those decisions? Benefits of establishing different legal entities, and then we'll go through some examples of the different entity options that are out there. And then we'll take you into some more detail around the actual filing process. And then I will give a very brief high-level overview of some of the resources that are available at Case. Now, all of this that's being shared is for, your educational purposes. I definitely encourage everyone to work with their legal counsel to make those decisions around what entities to form, when, and how. So again, my name is Starlyn Priest. I am the facilitator. I'm an EIR with Case Veale Institute of Entrepreneurship. I went to Case, so I am a Case alum at the law school. I have an MBA from Cleveland State, and I also have an undergraduate degree in business economics from the College of Worcester. So my pre-law school experience focused in management consulting. I've consulted with a number of different industries. My experience in law school really focused around working with startup companies on a number of intellectual property, corporate transactions, on corporate formation matters. And I've had cross-industry experience, as you can see there below. I've worked with a number of different companies across a number of different industries. So I like to just kind of give a purview of, before what you want to consider even before you file to establish a corporate entity. So some of your pre-launch considerations here, I'll just kind of go through these blocks. So you want to make sure that before you're even, launching a company, you have this idea, you're at the beginning stages. You want to first start off with, does your company, have you actually identified a problem that you're solving? So your entrepreneurial bug should always start with that. What is the problem that you're actually solving? You want to spend some time talking to subject matter experts and conduct, more research to understand the industry, who are the players in the industry. Conducting a thorough market analysis, your competitors, understanding who your customers are and who you're actually selling to. So spending some time doing that pre-work, that precedes, even moving into the stage of filing for a corporate entity. Just want to make sure that you're not putting the horse before the carriage there. You want to also identify some of your internal gaps. So maybe there's some talent gaps that you need, some insight that you don't have that's on your initial startup team. That's very relevant to establishing what your internal, where your internal gaps are to help you launch successfully. You want to make sure that if maybe your company focuses in more of a tech space, identify if you can actually begin an early assessment of customer acquisition. So, what do your early customers look like? Can you acquire through some kind of beta test early users of your technology? You want to develop and refine your product, service, and offering. So again, a lot of these things happen before a corporate entity is necessarily started. And depending on where you are, and we'll talk a little bit about this later in the presentation, but depending on where you are in that development process, some of this can happen prior to actually forming the company itself. Couple other things on this slide. You want to develop possibly a minimally viable product. So if you're in more of the product space, see if there's a way for you to develop just a baseline product to test your product in the market. Case actually has some really great resources that are out there that can help you to do that. One of the other things I would be remiss if I didn't mention, you want to make sure that when you're naming your company or your products, you definitely want to work with your counsel or work with some kind of legal support that would actually help you with identifying any potential issues with federally registered trademarks or even state registered marks as well. So in addition to that, you also want to double check for, websites, so the web real estate. These are a lot of the considerations that you want to make even before you move into the space of founding or filing for the official entity. So when we look at, the beginning stages of, a startup, there's a number of different funding mechanisms or funding sources that you can go to. Of course, a lot of people think, I have a company, it's a startup, I want to go for lending. You will find that lending sometimes is not the best for some types of startups. So it really just depends on what kind of business you actually have. That will drive whether or not banks would be the best option for securing financial support in the beginning of the startup stage. So you have your lending, of course, you have your friends and family. If you're lucky enough to have your family that believes in you and wants to contribute to that beginning stages of, securing funding. You have angel investors, venture capital. Of course, you hear lots about, some of the larger tech companies receiving funding through those different funding mechanisms. And then non-financial support, you also want to consider that as well. So typically you think you're building, your financing and your resources are just focused on the money, but it's also about your non-financial support as well. So you want to look at possibly building a board of advisors that can also be very instrumental in making your decisions in those early stages.
Wait, before you go on, can I add one thing, Starlyn, if I can?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say in the previous chart, the best form of non-dilutive capital is a government, and I think that's particularly true when it comes for faculty. So your SBIRs, your STTRs, and just plain old government DARPA programs. I mean, they're funding technology, if it's technology related, they're funding, technology development, and it's non-dilutive. They don't take an ownership share. So I would definitely add that to your list.
You know what? Yes. And you make a very good point. That is one very significant, actually, it's a very significant bucket that people don't necessarily know lots about. But yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that contribution, Al.
Okay.
So some other factors that you want to consider in those beginning stages, you want to look at, do you have the right team? Again, doing that talent gap assessment. Will you need investors? So as Al mentioned, there are, opportunities to, access funding that may not necessarily involve equity ownership in your company. Will you have consultants or other technical labor or independent contractors that you need to hire? You want to work with your counsel to make sure that, you have proper insurance coverage if depending on what kind of business you're starting. Relationships with financial institutions, very important. Relationship, obviously, with legal counsel. I'm obviously throughout this presentation will, really drive that into, having your counsel in the beginning can definitely help to avoid some pit traps, some issues that some companies face later down the line. And then definitely a relationship with an accounting professional, a tax professional. So those are some of the very important, critical resources that you want to have in place at very early in your process.
Well, one other point before you go, sorry, I won't interrupt anymore after that.
No problem.
The other thing I would also add is I think one of the places where people really fall down is particularly faculty is, you talked about MVP or minimum viable product. And depending on what you're talking about, if it's an app that's pretty straightforward. It takes very little capital. You could hire someone, you could almost do it yourself nowadays. So the idea is important. So the minimum viable product is not very hard to get to. If you're doing something like in the hard sciences, like what Ken Singer did, with folio photonics, or even in the medical space, an MVP is much, much harder to get to, and you're unlikely to get there without some sort of funding. And so I think that a robust discussion around what constitutes an MVP is important. I'm not saying to do that now. I'm just saying that is one of the biggest falling blocks, because people don't know what it is, don't know how far they have to get. And that's a really important point, is what I've learned. So.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely absolutely agree. And when you're talking about some of the great resources that, CASE has, not only the professionals or the professors, in addition to the professors, you have, a lot of great resources through, through the EIRs and through the Veale Institute that can definitely work to help help you understand what that is first, but then to also, point you in the right direction in terms of how to go about building that, where it's relevant, because not all businesses obviously would need, an MVP. So definitely a great point. Absolutely. So before you, just moving to the next slide here, you want to make sure that you check your company name availability before registration. So you definitely want to make sure that you're not naming your company a name that would later violate some kind of protected brand through the US PTO's office. You can take a look at that. And you see here, I have dropped the link for the trademark electronic search system, so you can actually work with your counsel. It is not as just simple as just kind of typing in the name. You definitely want trained professionals that know how to conduct those searches. So that is something that should be at top of mind in the very beginning stages. In addition to that, you want to make sure that at least for within your state. So if you're in Ohio, you want to make sure that you're taking a look at the trademark service mark searches, in Ohio, which you can access that through the Secretary of State's website, just to make sure that, whatever your company name is, it is not violating some kind of protected brand. But what I will say, and you want to work with your counsel to help, understand this more, is that if you only have a registered protected mark in your state, that does not give you federal protection. And so you definitely want to work with your legal counsel to understand, what is and is not a protected mark. So that's something you want to consider very early. So we have here an example of, obviously everyone knows Procter & Gamble. And so if you just did, a search for a USPTO search for Procter & Gamble, very well-known brand, Febreze, that this is considered a protected mark. So no one can go and, create a product within this space that would be named Febreze without getting a pretty nasty letter from Procter & Gamble's legal counsel. So this is just an example of, where you would find or what it looks like when you actually identify within the search system a protected brand. So just a sample for you guys. Now, on the state side, and obviously we're in Ohio, and so we're focused on Ohio's resources. So the Ohio Secretary of State, if you go into their trademark service mark search, you'll see, in this example, we typed the Ohio State University, and so you'll see that they have registered marks here. So kind of the same idea. You want to make sure that in advance of you starting your company or trying to file, that you are not actually violating a mark.
One thing I'd point out there too, Starlyn, is having gone through this, when I was running Kent Displays, our product line was called the Boogie Board. And that was our writing tool. And of course, there's a Boogie Board brand out there, the surfing thing. And so it was actually by Whammo. And so we had a lot of stuff going on, and they contacted us saying, we're using you're using our brand. And we had, we were in millions of units of sales by that point. So the two things I would point out is one, even if you have the same name, you can argue that, that it's enough differentiator. I mean, ours was a electronic writing surface. Theirs was a surface. So you can make that argument. The other thing that you can easily do, which we ended up doing, is you can pay them off. And, you can literally, I think we must have paid, it's not chump change, but I think we must have paid a few $1,000 for them to just basically go away. The only thing I'm raising that is that I'm saying that because it's not a showstopper if you actually using a name that someone else is using. And in our case, we had to keep Boogie Board. I mean, that was our brand. And so but it's easy to get around not always. I mean, Febreze is a different ball game.
Yeah, it depends. It definitely. So just to clarify, so I recommend that, if you do find that there is a naming overlap, that you work with your counsel to really understand where that protected registration is, what categories are actually protected. So yes, yes, you bring up a very good point that, if you just have the name in general, there's more conversation behind that, and we could totally unpack that.
How it's used. It's how it's used. It's a product category.
It's how it's used, and it's also the level of market penetration that you have as well. So that also impacts it, but that gets into some of the details of when you're working with your legal counsel. You want to make sure that they're, guiding that conversation with you about, kind of where the line starts and stops. So yeah, but Febreze is obviously a different level. You're talking about a massive international company. But yeah, on the forefront, I would say when you're thinking about naming the company, you definitely want to, work with your counsel to try to avoid those pitfalls as much as you can on the front end. So particularly in the very, very infancy startup stages. So forming the company. So I put together just kind of like a general company formation checklist here. Obviously, as a beginning company, you have to establish your employer identification number. You have to register with the state of Ohio, if you're in Ohio, of course, whatever Secretary of State for the state that you're in, or the company will be located. That's the resource or the source of where that registration process begins. So you want to submit your business filing to whatever the Secretary of State for whatever state you're going to be located in. Establishing a business bank account is obviously something that's a part of that process. You want to make sure there's separation between the company's resources and your personal resources. And then some relevant agreements that you want to have a conversation with your legal counsel about: partner agreements, operating agreements, investor agreements, employment agreements. So there's a number of different critical agreements, even if you are in the very beginning stages. So even if you're just working, maybe it's just you and a couple of friends, you definitely want to get some understandings in place in advance of problems. Everything is always great until it's not. And so when you have an agreement that kind of outlines the governance of your relationship, and particularly depending on what kind of entity you have, it'll become even more important. You definitely want to make sure you're keeping that in mind in the forefront and beginning stages of your company formation. So just wanted to kind of highlight, what are some of the very high level benefits to establishing a legal entity? Some people are just they're operating businesses, and they may not have a corporation or, a limited liability corporation. They may not have a corporate entity established. So I wanted to include a slide here that talked about some of the benefits of establishing a legal entity. So sole proprietorships are often the most common starting point for a lot of people, depending on the type of business that you are starting. When is it best to establish a legal entity? Well, and again, I always encourage you work with your legal counsel to explore that, but it becomes particularly relevant when you're talking about liability issues, the potential for you to be sued. If you don't have a corporate entity, you don't have the protection between yourself and the business. And that's when, depending on if you're sued and you're found liable in some kind of matter, it definitely goes directly to you in terms of, the losses that you can incur. Tax benefits, so there's a lot of tax benefits involved in having some kind of legal entity established. And then, of course, if you're looking to raise some investment funding at some point, having some kind of corporate entity definitely is an important, depending on the type of investor, they may have preferences on the type of entity. So sometimes you will see that a company starts off as a limited liability company, and then it will then transform into or be transformed over into a C corporation. Did you want to say something, Al?
I have a question on this chart. When you're saying sole proprietorship are often the most, a sole proprietorship, an LLC, is already an entity. And so I just want to, I'm actually asking that question because I want to be, and once you have that, an LLC, all of the things you have in the bottom, liability, unless I'm wrong, which I'd like to understand, liability, tax benefits, because it's a flow through, right? So liability, tax benefits, investment, fundraising, it can all happen with being a sole proprietor, right? Or am I missing something?
So there's lots to unpack in that.
Okay.
Because when you're talking about the limited liability entity, it has benefits of the sole proprietorship, but little dabbles of benefits from a C corporation, but not as much, you don't have the double taxation issue as a C corporation, but then you're not 100% liable for everything that you do. So there is some separation. The LLC is kind of like that middle ground.
Okay.
So while, yes, you could find some kinds of investors that would invest in you directly as a sole proprietor, typically, if you're talking about institutional investment, they will want some kind of separate entity. So it's driven by where you are in the stages and who has the skin in the game. As far as, preference, you're probably, I would be very shocked if you came across, say, a venture organization.
Yeah.
And so
right.
Where you are in the stage, but friends and family, obviously, that's a totally different conversation, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So, but even with a bank, if you're going to a bank, they're going to want to see even establishing a bank account, all of these things that you're going to need in advance of establishing those things. So while yes, there are effects for an LLC that are similar to a sole proprietor, there are also other aspects that have the benefit of a C corporation. So it's kind of the middle ground, so to speak. And again, I always encourage people, have that conversation with your legal counsel to really define that. But these are some of the big ones, the big buckets that are really impacted by formation of a corporate entity. All right. So when it comes to selecting which entity is best for your business, again, you work with your legal counsel. There's sole proprietors. There are the corporation. So sole proprietor is someone who owns an unincorporated business, as we talked about, as Al mentioned. Corporation, a C Corp, is a legal structure for a corporation in which the owners or shareholders are taxed separately from the entity. So that speaks to the separation that I mentioned. With a limited liability corporation, so a limited liability company, it's a business structure allowed by state statute. So essentially, there's some shared benefits, as I described before, between kind of some of the benefits you get from sole proprietorship and then some of the benefits that you get from a C corporation. An S corporation is a closely held corporation. It's what's considered a pass-through entity, where corporation, you elect to pass through corporate income, losses, deductions, and credits through to the shareholders for federal tax purposes. Typically, those corporations don't have many members or many shareholders rather. And then another category are partnerships. You can have a general partnership or a limited liability partnership or a limited partnership. So there's different categories even within a partnership. But a general partnership is a relationship between two or more people that are just doing business together for the purpose of profit. Each person contributes their own money, property, labor, skill. They share in the profits and losses of the business. The biggest driving factor with the general partnerships is that they are everyone's personally liable for the business that they're in. So if in the event that a general partnership is sued, then they are, personally liable. Limited partnership, it's similar to a general partnership. However, there's protection involved. So there is some kind of separation. Same goes with the limited liability partnership. So there's some kind of separation between the entity and the individual partners involved. So without digging down into the details, we'll talk about it a little bit later. But again, you want to work with your counsel to really identify what is the right entity for your business given the stage that you're in. All right, so some of the advantages and disadvantages for sole proprietorships. Obviously, with the sole proprietorship, it's pretty simple and affordable. There's no actual filing fees. You can just start doing business. There's operating freedom, so to speak. There's no formalities with a sole proprietorship, which is probably why it's appealing to some, depending on what kind of business they're in. Some of the disadvantages are what we referenced earlier. So there's unlimited liability. You are liable for all of the decisions that are being made, all of the risk that is being taken. So if you're sued, then you're sued directly. There's no separation between the owner and the business. There can be challenges raising investment funding, as we mentioned earlier, depending on the kind of funding you're looking to attract. That can deter maybe some kinds of funders, maybe not all. However, that can impact the conversation. And then another disadvantage is that it often leads to difficulty maintaining financial control. So as I mentioned earlier, you definitely want to make sure that you establish a business bank account and separate those two entities, or you separate your personal finances from your business finances. So a lot of times when sole proprietors tend to merge those two things, and that's definitely not a good thing, especially from a liability perspective, but also for tax purposes, et cetera. So you want to make sure you're keeping the business separate. All right, limited liability companies. So as I mentioned before, we kind of already talked about this. The limited liability company definitely has characteristics of sole proprietorship and a C corporation. With a limited liability company, there are some formation documents that have to be filed with the Secretary of State. So you have, when you're establishing a limited liability company, you file the articles of organization. So some of the things that you need as a part of the filing requirements, you need the words limited liability, limited, LLC. You will see these acronyms or these words following a limited liability company, because that's what gives the market the signal that this is what type of entity that they're doing business with. You definitely have to include an effective date for the company. There's, depending on your individual state statutes, they will have rules around whether, if you start the business first and then you later file the company or file the articles of the organization, sometimes they will allow you to backdate. For the state of Ohio, it's 90 days, well, no later than 90 days from the date. So there's some flexibility there. Period of existence, you don't necessarily have to include that. Purpose, there's some legal reasons as to why a company may not include that necessarily in their articles of organization, but they can. You'll want to talk to your legal counsel about some of the pros and cons of doing that. And then another item that's included on that list is an appointment of a statutory agent. So for the purposes of service of process, so unfortunately, if you are sued, then that would be the person that would be responsible for accepting that service on the company's behalf. So here is just an example of what it looks like when you have established in articles of organization that is a limited liability company. So we just pulled up, for those of you that know, Cover My Meds, very actually a very good success story in terms of a successful exit that the organization Jumpstart was a part of here in Northeastern Ohio. But Cover My Meds, it's an example of their articles of organization, just to give you an idea of what it looks like after you have successfully filed and the state has accepted your filing of organization. You'll see here, LLC follows the name of the company. So in terms of the in terms of other documents that should accompany your, you don't have to file them, but you do want to make sure that in your early stages of establishing a limited liability company, you work with your counsel to establish what's called an operating agreement. Your operating agreement really, it provides some very key information in terms of how the company functions. So it covers governance issues. So you'll see here on this slide, board of management, board meetings, board, composition, some of these very key details that you lay out, to understand how the company operates. It also includes membership interest details. So your classes of interest. So that means your ownership shares. So allocations, distributions, limitations to disposition. I bring this up because I'll just give an example. When I worked with some different startup companies through the IPVC, one of the things that we did a lot is when those startup companies wanted to bring on independent contractors, sometimes they would actually have they would pay their independent contractors in terms of interest shares in their company. So equity interest in their company. And so we would lay out for them their vesting schedule. So how much they're earning in terms of equity ownership in that business. Some of the details in terms of what the interests are, those details can be laid out in the operating agreement. So that's just an example of what those interests are, and then, where you will detail how those interests are maybe distributed, et cetera. So you work with your counsel on those decisions. Confidentiality agreements, you definitely want to have confidentiality agreements if you're, working with some proprietary technology. That's part of it. And then you have general provisions. Again, your operating agreement is kind of your steering ship on how the company operates. Some advantages and disadvantages of the limited liability company. As mentioned before, there's a separation between members and the business. It's easier to raise investment funding. Again, if you have some type of legal entity that separates yourself from the company, it's easier to raise that funding when you have that protection. With an LLC, there's I would say more loose formalities. So directors are optional. To Al's point earlier in our conversation, there is kind of that flow through tax treatment. So that's when we mention that is kind of the benefit or the characteristic that is similar to a sole proprietor. So you don't have, the same kinds of tax challenges that you may have with a C corporation. I should say the same kinds of complexities to the tax structure with the LLC. Some disadvantages, LLC, the limited liability is not recognized when a company is not treated as a separate entity. So again, that goes back to if you are, say, operating out of, say, one bank account. So you don't have a business bank account, you have one bank account, and it's your personal account as well as your business account. It really gets kind of hairy when you're talking about any instance where there might be some litigation, if you're sued or any other kind of liability issues. When you don't treat the company separate, it becomes a problem in the event that you do have some liability issues. Members must assume responsibility for their share of the LLC's income. So that's also, one of the disadvantages there. The process for creating a limited liability company. So again, I wanted to talk with you just high level about some of the key steps in the process. So you file your articles of organization. And as a matter of fact, actually, that should have been amended. I believe it's $99, not $125. So my apologies for that error there. Designation of your members. You definitely want to designate members, and you draft your operating agreement or declaration of affairs, even for a one-member LLC. Corporations. So you hear, obviously, your larger companies are normally formed as a C corporation. Not all, but many. That's when you, so just to define once again, a corporation is a legal structure for in which owners, shareholders are taxed separate from the entity. So again, that speaks to our conversation earlier about, having a separate identity for the company itself. So in terms of formation documents for a C corporation, instead of an articles of organization, it's called articles of incorporation. So what is the purpose of articles of incorporation? That's the document that when filed with the Ohio Secretary of State, it establishes the legal existence of the company. You can kind of think about the articles of incorporation as the company's, constitution, if you want to think about it like that. Articles of incorporation's filing requirements, you have to have the corporation's name. It must include, it also has requirements as far as, including the word corporation, company, or CO, for example, co. You must include the principal place of business, the number of authorized shares, including par value. So in terms of authorized shares, you want to establish how many shares can actually be distributed to other people. So without really digging down into all of the nuances, essentially, a corporation will have a set amount of shares of ownership, shares of stock. Those interests come with different rights. And so in that articles of incorporation, a company may lay out what those rights are. There's voting rights, there's rights to, there's an ability, if you have a share, there's an ability for you to receive some kind of dividend. So without going into all of that, you essentially, for the purpose of the articles of incorporation, it lays out how many shares have actually been authorized. Your initial stated capital, how much capital is going into establishing the company, your designated agent for service of process. So as mentioned, your service of process or your agent for service of process would be the person that would accept service in the event that the corporation is sued. And then corporate purpose, as I mentioned earlier, you may or may not want to include a corporate purpose. There are some legal reasons why you would not. So you want to work with your corporate, your counsel to, discuss what are some of the benefits to placing a purpose, company purpose or corporate purpose into the articles of incorporation, and some of the reasons why you would maybe not want to do that. But the trend, generally speaking, is that there will be a description that says legal business activities, for example. But again, work with your corporate counsel to define what the benefits are to doing that. All right, so in addition to your articles of incorporation for a C corporation, you have bylaws. What are the purpose of bylaws? So to establish a series of rules, policies, and processes that govern how a corporation will operate. So if you think about your articles of incorporation, like the Constitution, you can look at your bylaws kind of like your state laws. This is what, how the company will operate. So what topics are covered in bylaws? Your organization's name, purpose, if it makes sense, and location. Your election and voting process. So of course, unlike with other entities, you have, for the C corporation, you have shareholders. And so shareholders are going to vote on a number of different things. They elect the board members, the board of directors that are involved with the company. And so you really want to lay out some of the rules and regulations for how those different stakeholders, so your shareholders, your board of directors, and your officers interface, interact, what they can and cannot do, and all of the policies and processes involved with that. Your meeting processes. So obviously with a C corporation, or I shouldn't say obviously, but with a C corporation, you do have meeting requirements that are dictated. A lot of those are statutory. So depending on your state, that'll determine, for corporations, how many times your organization needs to meet or your boards needs to meet. Conflicts of interest provisions. So you definitely want to include that in your bylaws. Officer duties, that's also where you will detail that. Amendments to your bylaws, so you definitely want to include in there how can your bylaws be amended, and even your articles of incorporation as well, which those can only be amended by the shareholders. Bylaws can be amended by the board of directors. All right, so advantages of C corporations. I have three categories here, and we'll unpack a little bit. The first one, the C corporation has the greatest protection for shareholders and officers, unless there are situations where that protection is not honored. And again, that tends to be pretty extreme circumstances where a corporation is not going to be recognized as it protects, I would say, protect those shareholders and officers from decision making and just liability in general. So it has the greatest protection unless the corporate entity was undercapitalized, corporation funds were commingled with personal funds, corporate books were not kept separately, corporate actions were not authorized by the board of directors or the shareholders. So you do have situations where in moments of litigation, you may actually have a court say, hey, we're not actually recognizing this corporate entity for the action, and we will hold these, whether it's the shareholders or the officers, we will hold them accountable for the outcomes of whatever decision either wronged the company or wronged the shareholders. So extreme circumstances, but it definitely can happen. The preference, though, is to honor that protection and that separation. Venture investors do most times prefer C corporations. So even if you are, say, in the beginning stages, or maybe you're off to a good start in that startup stage, and you're looking to attract the first round of seed A funding, most times, more often than not, at some point, you are going to probably be encouraged to convert if you start off with an LLC, you'll be encouraged to convert into a C corporation. You'll see a lot that many of these companies or C corporations are based in Delaware. So Delaware is very corporate friendly, so to speak. So you see a lot of companies actually based, their articles of incorporation is filed in the state of Delaware. So it's commonly, again, C Corp's entity is commonly used by major investors. There's a benefit of creating preferred stock. So obviously when you have C corporations, there's preferred and then common shares of stock. Without going into great in-depth detail around that, those options are there with the C corporation. And then if you get to a point where you're actually talking about a potential IPO, a C corporation is the preferred vehicle in that situation. So the disadvantages of C corporations, without unpacking the long list, you want to work with your corporate counsel to become educated on what all of the disadvantages may be. But we've highlighted here just a couple. Operational formalities. So as I mentioned before, with a C corporation, you definitely have formalities that you have to follow. When you don't follow those formalities, again, it gets kind of a gray area in terms of honoring that corporate entity. So, particularly if you're entering into litigation or matters like that, they like to see that you have honored the corporation as a separate entity. So you have annual meeting requirements, you have appointment of director requirements. So all of those things are in there. Again, please, I encourage you to talk with your corporate counsel about that. Then there's what you'll hear a lot about, the double taxation issue. And what that essentially means is that you're taxed not only, so there's a couple of layers of taxation. So normally it may not be a problem because money is reinvested back into the company and not paid in dividends, but there's times where there are dividends paid, and it's taxed at that level. So it's taxed at the corporation level, it's taxed at your dividends level. So there's times where you might be taxed more than once, whereas when you're working with, or you have an entity that's, say, an LLC, you're not taxed multiple times. So again, to get into those details, please, I encourage you to speak with your tax professional, your accountant, as well as your attorney. So the filing process for creating a C corporation, you file your articles of incorporation with the Secretary of State for whatever state it is you're located in. You establish your company and authorize your equity, depending on how that you want to communicate that in that process of filing. You designate directors. Now, this conversation here is based around Ohio law, but if you're not located in Ohio, obviously you want to make sure that you're following the rules that are required for your individual state. but you designate directors. There must be at least 3 unless the number of shareholders is less than 3. So again, those are some of those statutory nuances here for the state of Ohio. You designate initial officers. So you have a president, secretary, and treasurer, and then you adopt a code of regulations. Again, that may not be a requirement, but it's pretty routine for that to be included. Your S corporations, we mentioned that earlier. So an S corporation is a closely held entity. It normally does not have many shareholders at all, but you pass through the corporate income, losses, deductions, and credits through to the shareholders for federal tax purposes. The advantages to an S corporation, a couple of advantages here that is noted. You have a flow through tax benefit. So that's one of the benefits of it. It allows, an S corporation allows you to avoid the double taxation issue that you have with the corporation's entity tax structure. Disadvantages, S corporations are responsible for tax on certain built-in gains and passive income. So again, you want to work with your counsel to identify if that makes sense. So there's 3 buckets of partnership, as I mentioned earlier. There's 3 types of partnerships. You have your general partnership, your limited partnership, and your limited liability partnership. Your general partnership, again, as I explained earlier, 2 or more people coming together as co-owners for to operate a business for profit. The biggest thing that I want to share with the general partnerships is that while there's no required filings, you might file, you don't have to, but you may file the statement of partnership authority. That can be useful in litigation in the event that there's any kind of conflicts between the partners, so to speak. Partnership can be formed upon agreement of the parties. So you don't necessarily have to file. And that's one of the advantages of a general partnership. You can actually be functioning and running a business and have informally created a partnership, even though you may not have intended to. So definitely something you want to talk with your counsel about. Internally governed by the partnership agreement. So if you have a partnership agreement, that's what's going to govern how you function in that partnership. The disadvantage, as I mentioned before, personal liability. So there's no separation there. So all of the partners involved will actually be accountable for any of the losses or liabilities of the business. Your limited partnerships, so that adds a layer, because I want to make sure that I leave some time for questions here. That does add a layer of protection. So the limited partnership advantages and disadvantages here. So advantages, the limited liability it's segmented across your general partner and limited partner. So you have kind of that 2-level managerial establishments. Your general partners have complete managerial control, ability to bind the partnership as an agent. So they're acting on behalf of the partnership. Your limited partners have the benefit of limiting their partnership liability to the amount of their investment. You will see that a lot of times when it comes to venture companies with different investments, there are limited partnership entities that are created for investment purposes. Some of the disadvantages, general partners are jointly and severally liable for a partnership debt. So if you're the general partner in a general partnership, then you are, liable for all of the liability of that limited partnership's activities. Limited partners have no managerial control, so that could be an issue if you're just a limited partner in that entity structure. Now there's limited liability partnerships we're going to talk about here. So partner liability, one of the advantages is that partner liability is limited to the amount of their investment. So if you put in $50,000, then your liability is limited to the $50,000 in turn, and it allows for partners to have more control. In addition to that, you have equal control and limited liability. It's better than limited partnerships or general partnerships where at least one partner has unlimited liability. The disadvantage, you do have filing requirements. Parties are required to file a statement of qualification with the Ohio Secretary of State or whatever state you're located in. There are, as I said, filing requirements in order to maintain the partnership's authorization to do business. Now, again, this is specific to Ohio, but will have state requirements around that. So I wanted to, as the last, last leg of the presentation, to kind of dig into what it looks like when you're going through an online business filing process with the Secretary of State. This is specific to Ohio. So when you go into the area of your Ohio Secretary of State website or for Ohio, you will see in the very beginning, it'll say, hey, do you want to file a new business or register a name? This is kind of the beginning stages of when you're going through the filing process. As you'll see, there's some other options here, but if you're just starting a company, file a new business or register a name, it's going to be where you begin. When you click in there, you will then see, you'll have the option to choose what types of entities you want to establish. So this will be kind of your next page that you'll see. This page here shows kind of a drop down. So this is where you actually select the different types of entities, and they do have, based on when this screenshot was last taken, they do have the pricing for all of the filing fees. So again, you have to pay your filing fee when you're actually, trying to complete the filing. You can't send in payment later. You can go through and do it online. So this stage right here, you want to make sure that you conduct first a preliminary search of the state name registration. So I mentioned earlier that you want to make sure that you're checking for if your company name is registered as a mark. So this is the space where you would actually get that information and at least have a general search. You want to work with your attorney to maybe do a bigger dive into that search process, but there is a search bar within the Secretary of State's website that would allow you to do that as well. So when you get to, and this is for a limited liability company, you get to, your articles of organization for a domestic limited liability company. This is, again, assuming that you want to establish a company here. You want to establish a company here in Ohio. So you have your limited liability, you click in there and you enter your company name. Again, I'm just showing screenshots of what it looks like when you're building that articles of organization, going through that online process. Here, what you'll see, so back to P&G again. This is an example of what it looks like once your entity has already been established, how it will come up on a search under the Ohio Secretary of State's website. So if you search Procter & Gamble, this is what would come up. So as you can see, it's a corporation for profit. You see that it was established, very old company. As you see, I think it's 1905 here. So obviously a very, very old company. Where it was established, the location. So that's what it looks like once you've completed the filing process and the state has accepted your registration. So just to round out here, because I know we are coming up on our, let's see here, we probably have maybe no more minutes, but I just wanted to also share Case Western's resources for entrepreneurs. So obviously, we have a number of different resources. I just want to go through this here. So we have Case's Sears Thinkbox. So the Thinkbox is actually a really great resource for those that are looking to create, it's a makerspace. But so those who are looking to create prototypes or some kind of, physical fabrication. There's a number of different resources there. I'm not sure, as a result of COVID, I'm not sure if they're open 100%, but you can definitely reach out to them. Feel free to email them at their intake email address, thinkbox@case. The other entity or the other resource guide that I wanted to share was the IP Venture Clinic. Of course, that's where I come from, but the IP Venture Clinic works with a number of regional partners. They are a part of what the network called LaunchNet. LaunchNet is actually the collegiate network for student entrepreneurs. So you'll see that Case is involved, Kent State, Baldwin-Wallace, Lorraine College. So definitely a number of resources here. Just wanted to place that out there so that you can reach out in the event that you wanted to learn more or reach out to resources. So that is it. Of course, this is sponsored by the Veale Institute of Entrepreneurship. And so if you want to reach out, again, the EIRs, I work with an amazing team of very experienced professionals that have done lots of work with startups. So definitely reach out if you're interested in receiving some type of support or resources. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Starlyn. Any last questions before we wrap up here?
Yeah, I want to make sure we get to those questions. Oh, yes, Bob Sop. Hi, Bob. I'm sorry I didn't have your information there. Bob Sopko, he left his information in the chat, so please take, feel free to reach out to him. He's an amazing resource. Bob, did you want to speak a little bit?
No, that should do it. Well, if you could just, one thing that, and I wanted to get your opinion on this. A lot of people form an LLC, and if you talk to like Drummond Road Capital, Morris Wheeler, he'll just smack you silly if you don't go right to C Corp. Now, my question is, I've heard both sides of the equation. People say, oh, LLC to C Corp, it's an easy transition. I've heard other people who've gone through it who say, oh my gosh, why did I start as an LLC? What is your experience been on that?
Well, I will say, so I've worked with a couple of companies that have made the conversion. It depends on what they mean by difficult. So you actually handle the process through the online platform. So in terms of just actually like going through the process of filing, that's probably maybe not what they're talking about. What they may actually be talking about is that as soon as they make that conversion, they now have all of these requirements that they have to apply.
Yeah. We have to have board meetings and everything else.
Exactly.
And I think they waited a little too long. They were a little bit too mature, and I think there was some additional gathering of information because they didn't, unexpectedly they advanced at a nice pace.
Yes.
But a number of their investors were like, "What? LLC? No, we just won't. We just will not. No safe note. No nothing. We're done with the equation." So
yeah. And that's why, I mentioned that, hey, some people start off in the beginning and when you hit that stage where you actually want investors and you don't want kind of any limitations on who you can have a conversation with, typically that's where they're going to end up. If they have an LLC, definitely not as a sole proprietor. Most times it's just not going to happen. If you're serious investors, they want to know that this standalone company is standing alone. And anything that happens, it's the company by themselves. They're putting their money into the actual company. And so there has to be most times some separation between the two. But yeah, what they were probably talking about is, as soon as you make that conversion, there's the requirements for the, the board books, the annual meetings, how the revenue and the reporting on taxes. And it just completely kicks it up a notch.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Always, per usual, very informative. Thank you again.
Yeah. Thanks, Bob. Anybody else have? Oh, I do see another question here. Let's see here. Is there a particular structure preferred for a holding company? So there's a lot of questions. So James Artis, I don't know if you're still on the line, but I'll go ahead and answer that question. There's a lot to unpack in that, but I will say this. You'll see holding companies that are, so I guess it depends on what you mean by a holding company. If what you mean by a holding company is, say, for example, a company that holds interest in other companies, it really just depends on what your goals are in separating entities in that way. You could say that if you make those separations, you're separating liability. But then on the other side, if you're talking about, say, a holding company that holds certain assets, maybe real estate, you'll see a lot of times real estate companies will create, an LLC specifically to hold one property, and then they'll have multiple properties and different entities for that. So it depends on the reasons why. Also, you could find that there are larger companies that have interest in other companies. It may not necessarily be an LLC. It could be like a C corporation. They may have interest in other companies. So I would say this, without having kind of some insight into what you mean when you say holding company, it's kind of hard to guide the answer for that, but definitely is a really good question to talk with your legal counsel about.
Okay, thank you so much, Starlyn.
Oh, hi, James. Let's see here. Do we have any other? Does that make sense, though, James?
Oh yeah, it made
wanna-
perfect sense.
Did you want to provide like any context?
Oh no, so what we did, we started out as an LLC, like we have a speakers agency, and then
Okay.
because of COVID, we ended up starting another entity, which ended up being a C corp. So now just to have some sort of consolidation to bring everything under like one umbrella. So, we're talking to our tax accountants and we're talking to our corporate lawyers, but I think it's always good to get, other people's insight and opinion.
Sure. So if I hear correctly, you have a C corp and you also have an LLC, but you want to consolidate that LLC business into the.
Yeah, we're just trying to really figure out what is the structure to bring everything, because it's an administrative nightmare right now
Yeah.
with taxes and agreements and all that stuff. So.
Well, I will say this. This is more from, so I'm saying this from more of a business perspective. Definitely work with your legal counsel. But I would say from a business perspective, if there is not a tremendous value to having the speaker business separated into that LLC, where you could essentially take all of those services that you offer and make it a service line in the corporation. I don't know if that's the direction you want to go, but make it a service line within the corporation. You could talk to them about, or talk to your legal counsel about dissolving that LLC. It really depends on what's the significant value of having it separated in that way. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Let's see here. Did we have anybody else? Any other questions? Let's see. It looks like we got all of them. All right.
Great.
Thanks. Thank you so much, everyone. I have my LinkedIn was put out there, Starlyn Priest. Again, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Thank you so much, Starlyn, and have a great day, everyone.